Okay, so I note that we have been a little bit behind, but this lecture for which I'm recording for Friday, September 12th, with this lecture, I hope to catch up entirely and put us right on line with the syllabus. Okay, so I'll do my best to do that. So we're going to talk about Plato's Republic, books 2 through 4, which have been assigned for Thursday and Friday. Now, I notice that some of you are a little bit off as far as what I have assigned. And I looked at my page numbers in my edition of Classics of Western Philosophy, and the page numbers are correct. And so I'm suspecting, now I didn't see them when I got online, I didn't see a new edition. So the edition I have should be good as far as the pagination. I suspect that CCRI bookstore at Warwick bought an older edition, and that could be messing you up. So, boy, what to do about that? Just continue doing your journals, because if you're reading from the Republic, that's good, and you will get lecture material on all of it. Okay. And in the meantime, if after I'm done with this lecture, I have to go into the syllabus and be a bit more precise, give you a bit more precise instructions about what parts of the Republic you have to read, I'll do that. Okay, so let's dive right into this. We have Plato's Republic, books 2 through 4. If this obeys me, it's going to move to the next screen, which it just has. So, retrospect and prospect. Let's summarize the results of book 1. Okay. So, and a lot of you were very excited by what you encountered in book 1. A couple of you were baffled, but most of you were quite pleased by what you gathered from book 1. So, let's try to gather that up, bundle it together, and move forward, see if we can make some progress towards answering this perennial question. What is the very nature of justice, and what contribution does it make to human happiness? So Socrates and others speak of justice in three general and distinct ways. They talk about it as the quality of an action, because there are just actions and there are unjust actions. They talk about it as a quality of character. You can have a just soul, which, by the way, would cause you to produce just actions, or you can have an unjust soul, slightly unjust, like a little bit morally mediocre and slightly worse than somewhere in the middle, or really unjust. You can furnish yourself with your own example, and that unjust soul would condition or stand behind, cause one to perform unjust actions. So 1 and 2 are connected to one another. And the third way was talked about was as a quality of an entire life, whether to lead the life of an unjust man, and they're thinking of a tyrant there clearly, or of a just man. Thrasymachus is explicit about it, somebody who takes possession of an entire city, though we saw that that's actually rather small potatoes in comparison with what his concept of perfect injustice actually implies. So on Socrates, now of course all these are connected. If a person has an unjust soul, then he'll perform unjust actions, and if he is either courageous enough, which Thrasymachus never mentions, or if he has the right technique, which Thrasymachus can sell him for a fee, right? Then he might just go ahead, take control of a city, maybe even form an empire. And if he has enough technology at his disposal, maybe a world empire. If he can get his hands on Google and Twitter X, right? You guys follow me? And maybe some spyware hawked by Mossad or whatever the latest stuff coming out of Israel is, and can engage in a kind of systematic mind control endeavor with Hollywood and music and so on and so forth, because those are propaganda instruments. You can shape how people think with those, and they do, right? And then for those who don't behave, he maintains a quite elaborately worked out prison system, okay, and a system of justice in which, because of his access to incredible amounts of money and to the methods of intimidation, he has more or less most of the judges in his pocket, or more fundamentally, He's bought off the law schools with incredible amounts of money, law school grants and things of that sort. So he gets to have a say on what they actually learn there. He does the same thing at the medical schools and determines their curriculum so that they are taught to effectively hawk medicaments, which he's heavily invested in, so he ends up making a lot of money in it, so on and so forth. If this individual, right, who's unjust and is armed with all that, the technology and the money I just mentioned, maybe he can establish a world empire. Maybe he and a few of his friends can, right? It might be more of a oligarchy, aristocracy type thing. No? Maybe they already have. Have you thought about that? Okay. So, on Socrates' view, from which he distances himself at the very end, all just men aim at moral perfection for themselves and others. Okay? 2, when they rule, they institute laws that perfect human beings. There's a mistake in the PowerPoint. Presumably towards justice and the other virtues to the degree that they are in reach. So just as, this is a man who works with bronze, takes the lump of bronze and shapes it up into a statue of Teddy Roosevelt. Say Teddy Roosevelt, why not? So an actual ruler who's a kind of model of craft, because if you recall, the crafts are rulers of their materials, right? According to Socrates, and Thrasymachus reluctantly agreed. So rule ends up being the kind of model from which other crafts take their nature, as it were, as rulers of their materials. The ruler, like the sculptor of bronze, he perfects something too. He perfects human beings, but he perfects them by bringing them to the high point of virtue, or as high a point as he can do. 3, and all just men harm no one in the strict sense of making persons morally worse. Quite the opposite, right? They perfect them. They don't corrupt anybody. They perfect people. That's what they do. And if somebody resists their art, that's not their fault. So note that this is compatible with the doctrine of corrective punishment, namely that one may harm a person physically, right, through fines or through loss of freedom for the sake of instructing that person, and I would say shaping that person in justice. Okay, so there we go. So justice and philosophy. No mention as yet has been made of how the philosophical life fits into all of this, though the philosophical life is continuously exemplified by Socrates himself, so it's right there. But a pathway has nonetheless been opened. For if justice is helping friends by giving them what is due to them, and to help means to give good things, then one of those good things that we owe friends is truth. Okay, let's talk generally about good things, right? Well, truth is one. That's accurate information, and maybe truth in the higher sense, like truth about the nature of reality and of goodness and of beauty. Okay, we can give people labor, help them, building something or moving, whatever it may be. We can give them objects like food or clothing, okay? And we can recommend them to other persons. You follow? If you write a letter of recommendation for somebody to get a job, or just put in a good word, right? And in a kind of basic way, which doesn't get mentioned here, it's not really a concern of ancient philosophy, we can just say hello to a person and recognize that individual's humanity. That's actually a going issue today. When you get on the bus drivers don't like the fact no one says hello to them. And if you say hello to the bus driver, in my experience, they'll say, "Oh, thank you. You're the first person the entire day who has said hello to me." Okay. Anyway, they're all about to be replaced with androids, so we're going to see how that goes. I predict it's not going to go terribly well overall for our society, but we'll have a look at it when it occurs. We'll talk about it then. Probably not, but maybe we can. You can shoot me an email, and I'll have an exchange with you. For example, one should not tell a friend that a polluted lake is perfectly safe for swimming. Okay? You would owe your friend the truth on that matter. Nor should a man tell his wife that he is a faithful husband when he is maintaining a kept woman, which has been a common enough occurrence. Oh, you know what a kept woman is? That's a woman who doesn't work, nor is she married. She's effectively the girlfriend of a married man, his number two, right? And he maintains her in an apartment somewhere. If he's particularly wealthy, in a house, okay? And that's what she does. She just waits for him. Okay. Nor strictly should one it's a really undignified way to live, unfortunately, for that woman. And no man should do that to a woman, and a woman shouldn't accept that position in life. But it's happened many times, including people I know, okay? Or know of or am connected to, let's put it that way. Nor strictly should one represent religion, religion X, whatever that may be, as true, unless one believes it to be true, okay? I'll skip that next point there. There I say you can actually argue for and against various specific faiths, which for me is an interesting thing to do. However, one ought as best as one can to represent reality as a whole, and the good things that are in reach of human beings. And one should do this as truly, completely, and accurately as possible, okay? Otherwise put, we owe it to one another to engage in philosophy. This is what Socrates and Plato have found rooting about in the depths of human nature. We actually owe it to one another to engage in philosophy and to share the fruits of our efforts as best we can. There's a typo there. So the incorrigibly competitive, persons who just want to win, right? Or maybe those who are inclined towards resentment and hatred, they exclude themselves from this community of what they call friends of discourse or philosopher friends. Okay, so we're getting a picture here. Socrates has kind of painted a picture through his conduct and through a couple of his statements of a good society, part of which would be composed of persons who engage in philosophical activity and who cooperate with one another in goodwill in coming to deeper knowledge of the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? That's the ideal picture there. Thrasymachus says, forget about it. None of that stuff is of any interest to me anyway. And what we should work on is mastering the arts of persuasion and of crafting laws which exploit people to their maximal capacity. And then you'll get the really good stuff, which is wealth and reputation. All right. So this is the general situation that we inherit in Book 2. Glaucon puts his finger on the thesis, right, that was sort of percolating beneath the surface throughout Book 1. Justice is good for the soul. And he wants to challenge this thesis. Okay, so this is the idea that, just being a good person is good for your soul. Your soul's in a better condition if you're a good person. I'll use the word good for a moment rather than justice. And that being a bad person, dishonest, ready to cheat, that's bad for your soul, right? Okay, very good. So that's sort of common sense, right? And remember, they're arguing or having this discussion in the pre-Christian period. So they haven't been taught anything about the law of the gospel, about charity. They don't have the 10 Commandments, so most of the 10 Commandments, you might even say all of them are just common sense in a way. So none of that's there. But they do have a kind of natural sense that being a morally decent person is good for you as a person. It's good for your soul. And being a wicked person is bad for you as a person. So Glaucon now challenges this. I've already pointed out that Glaucon is young, fresh, spontaneous, witty, and erotic. He utilizes rhetorical compulsion to bind Socrates where he is and force to give him a fuller account of his opinions, Socrates' opinions, right? So, rhetorical compulsion, you see that? Okay, very good. There's coercion again. Socrates would like to beat it out of it. Remember that Socrates originally wanted to leave. And, Glaucon hasn't really been much of a help to Socrates in trying to get out of the Piraeus, go home, go to sleep. Here's the second time Glaucon binds Socrates, and perhaps we can discern a certain pleasure Glaucon is taking um, in exerting a certain power over his erstwhile educator and mentor. So again, back to this theme, the Socratic mask of irony is being tugged at. Glaucon, Socrates' seeming friend, has joined forces momentarily at least with Thrasymachus. Okay? So his words are, do you wish merely to have seemed to persuade us, or really to have done so? Really to have done so, of course, right? Seriously, what else could Socrates say? So now Glaucon introduces three categories of good things in order to provide a certain basic structure for the ensuing exchange. On the one hand, now I'm using modern terminology, but they correspond to what he's talking about. On the one hand, there are intrinsic goods. There are goods which are goods in themselves, or there's a good that you can take an example of a good that's a good in itself. For example, beauty. Beauty is good in itself. There are instrumental goods like power and money. Ignore the fact many people treat them as if they are intrinsic goods. In fact, they're instrumental goods. They're good for something else. What you can buy with money and what you can do with your power. And there are goods that are both intrinsic and instrumental. For example, knowledge. It's just better to have knowledge than to be ignorant. But you can also use the knowledge in order to act more effectively in the world and achieve a desirable and good aim. Okay? So what do we have? There are two basic alternatives. There are intrinsic goods and instrumental goods. And then there's the conjunction of the two. I said hybrid here, but there's a conjunction of the two. So the alternative categories are not mutually exclusive. Like sometimes you do have a strict dichotomy. Like for example, either God exists or he does not exist, right? It's one of, you can't combine those two. But here, this is a different type of dichotomy. We have intrinsic goods and instrumental goods, and indeed they do conjoin in the case of goods that are both. So intrinsic goods are basic. If you look at this list, we have intrinsic goods, instrumental goods, and goods that are both. You might say, okay, so the basic dichotomy is intrinsic good and instrumental good, and these things are equally basic. That's false. The intrinsic good is basic, and instrumental goods are defined with reference to intrinsic goods. But the opposite is not the case. Do you follow? So what's instrumentally good? It's only good insofar as it gets you to an intrinsic good. For example, well, knowledge is both, but knowledge is an intrinsic good. And so reading a book, that's only good, that's an instrumentally good action insofar as it serves the end of acquiring knowledge. Okay? Very good. We'll leave it at that. Socrates claims that justice occurs in both categories at once. It is good in itself, because it's good for the soul, right? He didn't say that, but we can fill that in. And it produces good results. Well, the good results are just actions, right? So Glaucon makes the case for justice being merely instrumental good. That is good. It's good for getting other things that are good. Now, what Glaucon seems to have in mind, by the way, seems to be pleasure. He's like I said, he's a erotic fellow oriented towards pleasure. Okay. So first, he argues that justice does not even exist by nature, but is a convention, something people agree upon. And it's a convention not of all people, is a convention of the subset of our species, namely those people who are weak. Now that's the majority of people, but it's still a subset. So it's a convention arrived upon by the weak so that they can avoid a situation that is much worse for them. All right, so the weak need some kind of protection. They band together. They establish a system of justice with a police force, courts, and prisons. And they do this so that if anyone tries to take advantage of them, knowing that they're weak, they can appeal to something stronger than themselves. The police force, which collectively is much stronger than any individual person is, and is collectively much stronger than any one criminal, right? the system of justice, the prison system, the courts, and the prison system, right? So very good. For a condition without laws, I mean, why do they do this? If the system of justice, just use that one expression, cover everything I said. If the system of justice did not exist at all, that's equivalent to there being no law, right? Then each person would do injustice and suffer injustice in turn. So one person would do it and then he would suffer it. Okay. So, by the way, when Glaucon refers to doing and suffering injustice, he's actually presupposing natural justice, isn't he? The natural justice is on this conception, each person getting his due. So Glaucon's own argument is self-defeating. He presupposes that there's natural justice, but no matter, let's continue. Now, most people experience more pain at suffering injustice and pleasure at performing it. Okay, do you experience more pain when you're cut off in traffic than the pleasure you experience in cutting somebody else off? It's probably a true psychological observation, no? Okay, so on balance, life without law is painful. Let's say you're able to abolish the laws, okay? And you're able to do an act of injustice for everyone you receive. Well, if this principle is correct, on balance, it'll be psychologically more painful for you to live in that condition. Now, what would be the best thing of all from this point of view? Best of all, from this point of view, it's Glaucon's point of view, or the one he's describing at least, that would be to get away with injustice without ever being made an object of revenge. And it's like being in the position of like some hyper billionaire who could do whatever he wants. And if ever somebody, tries to bring him to court, well, he has 500 lawyers he can throw at that person. He'll be fine. So the worst would be to suffer injustice without being able to avenge oneself, right? So we have two extremes now. On the one hand, we have a lawless tyrant. Someone can do literally whatever he wants and no one's ever going to touch him, like Bill Gates or somebody like that. On the other hand, you have some poor slave somewhere who's utterly powerless and at the whim of anyone who's under that poor person's power, like some poor slave locked up somewhere in Long Island. There are slaves in Long Island and elsewhere in the U.S. or in Saudi Arabia or somewhere, okay? So I was thinking of a story about some poor woman who was locked up in Long Island, and got out. I mean, there'll be slaves here in Rhode Island too. Okay, so go over to, I'm not going to tell you where they are. I think they're on Chalkstone Ave. So the risk-averse multitude, and the governor knows it, and they don't do anything about it. So I'll leave it at that. So the risk-averse multitude opt to set up laws so that when any one of them does injustice, he is punished. But when he suffers it, the perpetrator is punished, right? Justice as law prescribing punishments is a conventional mean between the best and the worst possible life. Okay, so granting that Glaucon actually presupposed natural justice, he doesn't seem to be incorrect, right, in identifying a kind of conventional justice, which is the product of law. He would render his account more convincing if he acknowledged that there is natural justice and that itself is at the basis of the agreement come upon by a multitude, which agreement takes the form of actual laws which define, right, in a positive way what is just and unjust. And of course, those positive laws can miss the mark once you define them. And if we have natural justice behind the scenes, as it were, we have access to it through conscience, then we can have a discussion with one another concerning whether or not, in the case of a particular law, we've hit the mark or missed it. See what I'm saying? All right. If you're wondering about this natural sense of justice, that's exactly what Martin Luther King was appealing to in his letter from a Birmingham prison, which is a nice piece of work and well-reasoned. He is there arguing from the natural law, which presupposes natural justice. Okay? All right, next one. So the second step, there's a second step in Glaucon's challenge. Now, he wants you to imagine a weak, timid, risk-averse person suddenly coming into possession of extraordinary power, rather like one of Thrasymachus' students finally mastering the art of rhetoric, or a student at, say, RIC. We don't really teach propaganda at CCRI. A student at RIC mastering the principles of propaganda, which they teach there. They just call it public relations. Give it a nicer name, put a veil over it. What would such a person do? One might say it depends upon the character of the person, but Glaucon assumes that a seemingly just man given a ring of invisibility would immediately murder the king, right? Have intercourse with the queen, whom perhaps he has convinced that he is a god, and would make himself tyrant. Okay, so Glaucon's making an assumption. If you take an ordinary fella and you give him basically redoubtable power, like, extraordinary power that more or less puts him beyond the reach of anyone who would try to take revenge against him or harm him, then he'll behave virtually like a psychopath. Okay, here we go. So this ring he talks about grants the individual, who he calls Gyges, the power of invisibility, right? Okay, so the invisibility counts. Think about invisibility here. Invisibility is very important. If one is convinced that one can do injustice without being seen even by the gods, right? His question then would be, what reason will most persons have not to be unjust? Now, my sense reading your journals is that you're a group of decent people, and if you got your hands on a ring of power, that either none of you or almost none of you would do anything dishonest, right? It would probably make you feel like garbage if you did, right? Follow? But that's not Glaucon's supposition. And also, we're looking at a different historical epoch here, right? Western civilization was really died to the center by Christian ethics and the teaching of the law of the gospel and of neighborly love, okay, and forgiveness. So they don't have that doctrine in Greek antiquity. We have to keep that in mind when we read this book. So let's see here. What reason would he have not to be unjust? Now, for Glaucon, simply stating that justice is the good of the soul, that would fall short. As Glaucon has said, Socrates must explain the power that justice has in the soul to produce an outcome that is intrinsically good. Okay? So the text, when you read it, it can sound a little confusing. I'm trying to make it unconfusing for you. And I hope you can pay attention to this. Okay, I hope you're not like walking in and out of the room, making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. If you are doing that, do your darndest to pay attention to what I'm saying. So what Glaucon says is this: Socrates explained the power that justice has in the soul to produce a good outcome. What else could that be but happiness? So he's saying, Socrates, you've been telling me that justice is the good of the soul. Yeah, but the whole question comes down to what will make a person happy, that we can't help but want to be happy. And what contribution will justice make to that? Or, he's suggesting, will justice be an obstacle to that? Okay, very good. Now, what can one hide from the gods is my question. Now, if there is even one divine being, then presumably one can't hide anything. I mean, even if you had a ring of invisibility, wouldn't you think a god, extraordinarily powerful being, would have means to pick out where you are, right? Probably. Now, think about the doctrine of atheism in this connection. The atheist, the person who denies that gods exist, right? He's a person who, as a matter of a trivial implication from his atheism, believes that his actions are not visible to any god. So what he does in the privacy of his home, goes unobserved, right? And in a way, that becomes a kind of space where he can get away with virtually anything, unless, of course, the cops come knocking on his door and then do a search. All right. So perhaps in Plato's mind, there's an association, or this ring is a symbol of atheism. You think about that? Think about that. What happens when you take an ordinary fellow and you don't give him overwhelming power, but you teach him the doctrine of atheism? Is that going to modify his behavior somewhat? And the answer is, it's an interesting question. I guess it would differ from case to case, and you could imagine it would be yes in many cases. So I'll allow you to think about that. Now, notice that Glaucon had to make his point by offering us a fable rather than making an argument. He would have been more convincing if he had adduced a series of real case studies and shown that in every case where an ordinary person was given power, he always abused it. To quote Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Okay, so Lord Acton actually had historical examples in mind. Glaucon hasn't produced us any historical examples. And anyway, he ought to have, and not only that, there can be no exceptions to this, otherwise Glaucon's universal claim would fall flat, right? What about pious Louis IX? I mean, Louis IX is noted as a good king, or Philip II. There's a kind of consensus Philip II was halfway decent as far as things go, right? Wasn't too bad, as far as kings go. Actually, basically good. All right. So these are persons with, for their time, extraordinary levels of power, and they didn't abuse it. So how do we explain them? They're only possible of Glaucon's thesis that power corrupts absolutely, ultimately, is false. All right. So the partisans of justice and virtue make no bones about the fact that they form a minority. Okay? The partisans of justice and virtue, they're right up front with you, and they say, yeah, we constitute a minority of our species, but we're a dedicated minority, and Glaucon's generalization is false. All right. So it does seem that Glaucon's thesis is false. We don't want to get that wrong, but allow it to stand as presented. I don't mean believe it's true. Just take it for what it is. So we have two parts to his account now. The first was an account of the origin of conventional justice, which was plausible enough as far as things go. By the way, notice that account of the origin of law is a democratic theory of the origin of law. In Book 1 of the Republic, we encountered a tyrannical theory of the origin of law. The tyrant passes laws to his own advantage. For Glaucon, the demos, that is the multitude, passed laws for their own advantage. Now, Thrasymachus would simply say, yeah, but the demos in this case are acting as a kind of collective tyrant. That would be his reply to Glaucon. Okay, so what is the basic claim Glaucon's putting forward? Persons are just only on account of lacking the power to be unjust and get away with injustice. That's his claim, okay? To take note of that. Part 3. Despite the third part of his presentation, despite the flaws affecting the first two parts of his presentation, he acknowledged that natural justice exists. There are counterexamples to his universal thesis. He moves confidently to the third part. Here he attempts to show that the thesis that justice is always and under every circumstance preferable to injustice is actually mad. So, what we mean is that statement is false, right? He would say that, that justice is always and under every circumstance preferable to injustice. The statement is simply false, but believing it is a symptom of madness, right? A kind of defect of the intellect or illness of the intellect. Let's see. So he takes it to be self-evident that there are cases where justice is, in comparison with injustice, disadvantageous. All right. For if we were to imagine a perfectly unjust man, so here's the thought experiment he wants you to conduct. If we were to imagine a perfectly unjust man with a perfect reputation for justice, and think about it, if he's perfectly unjust, he'll go about succeeding, well, he'll certainly pursue through lying, right? A perfect reputation for justice. And if he's good, he'll get it. So imagine that perfectly unjust man with a perfect reputation for justice, on the one hand, versus a perfectly just man with a perfect reputation for injustice. You wonder how that would happen if the perfectly unjust man were to get the perfectly just man in his crosshairs, as it were, and smear his name. This happens. So we have whistleblowers, and it turns out if you study the matter, in some cases, the whistleblower was right, but he has no money and a few friends, and the people he's trying to expose, they have incredible amounts of money and lawyers and so on and so forth, and they have the media on their side, and so they smear the perfectly just person and make him look like a crank and potentially a criminal, and sometimes they get locked up. Okay? So, and I can think of concrete cases. There was a guy in California who exposed that Planned Parenthood was selling baby parts illegally, and so he got put in prison. His name was Daniel DeLayden, Daleiden, if you want to look that up. So that's how things work in the United States, folks. So there you go. So let's see here. So Glaucon says, if you look at these two men side by side, it would be hard. No, it would be impossible to maintain that the perfectly just man is better off than the perfectly unjust man. What would happen to this perfectly just man? Well, he'd be hated by all. He'd be dragged off and tortured to death. Right? That's the plausible outcome for someone with a perfect reputation for injustice, even if he is just. Now, the unjust man would be admired by all. He'd be honored, and he would enjoy all the pleasures of life, of the table, and he's wealthy, so on and so forth. He's a man, make him whatever he is. He'll enjoy all the pleasures of life. Very good. Grant even that the latter is living in a moral illusion. Okay? Grant that there is a natural justice, and the unjust man is living in a complete illusion. So Glaucon would say, is not a moral illusion less bad than being tortured to death? Okay, being tortured to death is tough, right? It's maximally tough. That's as tough as it gets, right? Okay, that all, I have to say, this whole discussion really turns on whether there's an afterlife or not. Because the man living the immoral illusion and acting unjustly, and we mean unjustly in a very big way, so there are murders and things of that sort there, and there's a lot of theft. If there's an afterlife and there's a penalty to pay for conduct like that, ultimately the disadvantage he has secured for himself is effectively infinite, right? So then one would have to inquire into the question of the immortality of the human soul. Is there any evidence that the soul outlasts the body? Take the just man by contrast. The just man, even if he's tortured to death, that only lasts whatever time. I recently suffered a toothache for 2 months. I didn't even have a cavity. I'm not, quite certain what. Well, I think I have an idea what caused that. A toothache and a headache that lasted 2 months. Okay, 6 weeks, 2 months. It was pretty tough, but it came to an end. And I've been in unbearable pain during previous periods for various reasons. The curious thing about unbearable pain is that it's sort of like we want to get rid of it immediately, and even if you wanted to put up with it, you can't form the will to put up with it. It's unbearable. But guess what? It doesn't kill you, and I'm still here, right? So they can torture the just man to death. If there's an afterlife and his justice will be rewarded, he's literally infinitely better off than the unjust man. So a lot turns out here on whether the soul exists or not, and whether it outlasts the body. And here you can look at some evidence about near-death experiences. I'm not going to cover that now. But, there's all sorts of stuff online. And there are people who were under surgery, and the doctor declared them dead. And they had all sorts of interesting experiences, including one woman who was blind. And she died in Arizona, I believe. I don't remember her name, or I tell you. And she claims to have left her body, and then she provided an exact description of the surgery room and the doctor and so on and so forth. And she couldn't have done that with her own eyes because she was a blind woman. And in any event, they had her put under. So you can evaluate that. So in any event, putting the afterlife to one side, if we grant that our soul does not outlast the body, in that event we could grant his point, right? So what then would we have learned, however? Because we have to look at this and ask, what's the pedagogical, that's the teaching value of this thought experiment? Most just people do not have reputations for injustice, and they tend to keep out of the way of powerful people and lead quiet, contented lives. So if you think about the just, honest people you know, okay? Are they running over to Raytheon and challenging them? You know, Raytheon has a center down in Portsmouth or wherever it is. You know, are they going to the governor's office and trying to arouse his ire? They tend to keep out of the way of that sort of thing, right? It is true, though, that when we consider perfectly just people, or nearly such, these people do get themselves into trouble. Socrates was killed. Jesus was killed. And the legal authority at the time, the Romans, found him innocent. They had him killed anyway in order to quiet the crowd, right? Gandhi was assassinated rather. Martin Luther King, he was assassinated. So yeah, there is something to this, you know, when people go beyond a certain boundary. And what happens is if people are extremely just, you know what they do? They end up pointing at the unjust persons. Unfortunately, very often people in power are unjust. They point at them and tell them they're unjust. They tell other people they're unjust. They demand that they change their behavior, and unjust people refuse to do that. And then the unjust, who lack conscience, right? They then conspire to kill the just man, and very often they succeed. All right, and you say, "Oh, wow, that really makes life sad." Again, it's that whole distinction. Do you accept basically kind of atheistic naturalism? That indeed would make life very sad. And if God doesn't exist, and when you die, you die, the wise thing to do would just be to keep out of the way of the powerful, unjust people as best you can, right? But if that's false, if we can prove that God exists, I'll reveal my hand here. I think it's not too difficult to prove that God exists. I'm going to give you a presentation later. Then that changes everything, really. Okay, that changes everything, really. And if that's the case, you know, from certain, you know, on the basis of certain religious doctrines, dying the death of a martyr is a great honor. It glorifies your Creator and secures for you eternal blessings. That all depends, right? Does God exist, and is He the kind of God who wants to be glorified in that way? Christians say yes. Others, Muslims actually say yes too, by the way, right? And you can say Jews say that. You can find passages in the Old Testament, for example, in Daniel, right? All right. That's what you got to think about, guys. There we go. Now let's turn to Adeimantus. So my overall interpretation of Glaucon's challenge is that it's not too successful. All right? For the reasons I stated. He basically acknowledges there is a natural justice. Very good. He ignores the historical fact of there being good people who held positions of high authority and power. Okay? And his final thought experiment, that one's more successful, but he also ignores the fact that there are persons who, you know, maybe they're not as just as Socrates or Jesus Christ, but they're good people, you know, consistently, and they stay out of the they manage to avoid the attention of unjust power and lead relatively decent lives, which would mean that they could lead a happy life, right? And that justice, that honesty, that decency would be a major ingredient, okay, in that happy life. All right. So now we turn to the next fellow, Adeimantus, who is Glaucon's brother. They were both historically brothers of Plato. Adeimantus' name means hard, and we'll see that he actually has a harder worldview. So Adeimantus adds a distinct challenge. His speech is considerably more moderate and conventional than Glaucon's. It is also delivered with a tone of moral outrage. He argues that parents teach their children that justice is necessary in order to have a good reputation, that is merely instrumentally good, right? But these same parents do not add that justice is intrinsically good. Okay. He introduces the theme of religion, which Glaucon left out because Glaucon presumably is an atheist. And Adeimantus complains about those who think they can coerce the gods not to punish them through magical incantations. So magical incantations, now we're in the realm of magic, which goes beyond sacrifice, right? Cephalus was trying to get his way into a comfortable afterlife with sacrifice. Others say we can actually use a kind of spiritual technology. Have any of you, hope you haven't fooled around with magic, where you buy some book and you draw a pentagram on the floor, throw a little sulfur, so on and so forth, and try to compel spirits to do what you tell them to do. Okay? If you don't mind my saying, it's not going to work, but some people think that they can do that. So whereas we use the various sorts of doctrines of physics and chemistry in various branches of engineering as a technology which enables us to master matter, there are people who attempt to use magic to master the spiritual realm as a kind of parallel technology. Not as well known and not as successful, but some people claim they can do it. So the combined speeches of Glaucon and Adeimantus leave Socrates for a moment clueless as to how to defend justice. But what choice does one have, right? Right? What choice does one have? Socrates is really painted into a corner now. He has to say something. So let's see how he proceeds. So this is how Socrates succors justice. So justice is, as it were, sick and lying in bed, and Socrates is going to put a thermometer in Justice's mouth, and then take a towel and heat it up and put it on Justice's forehead, and then go make some nice hot chicken soup. And he's going to try to help rehabilitate justice here. So Socrates said that he would mistrust both Glaucon and Adeimantus on the basis of the speeches they made on behalf of injustice. Now it is obvious, right, that these speeches were formal, prepared speeches. Those were not simply extemporized. They have something of the character of Thrasymachus in them, don't they? That's if they had been studying with him on the sly. They had apparently been collaborating and encouraging one another, apart from Socrates, to offer him a strong challenge. Okay, because just as Thrasymachus had his ear to the floor, he knew that sooner or later he was going to run into Socrates, and he had sort of prepared himself for this encounter. And that little sheep shepherd speech he gave was probably prepared in advance, and that was his last sort of ditch effort to defeat Socrates. Didn't work. It was a pretty brilliant speech as far as things go, but it didn't work. And Glaucon and Adeimantus, they're not convinced by this whole spiel that justice is the good of the soul, and if you have that, you'll have all you need to be happy, as it were, right? It suffices on its own to make you happy. And they come up with these objections. And that's meant to prod Socrates forward to explain himself more fully, and that Socratic mask is slipping off a little bit further. So Glaucon and Adeimantus also state that they still believe that justice is preferable to injustice. One doesn't quite understand why they believe that, but that's what they say. Socrates states that he still trusts them on the basis of their character. That is, he's observed them in action. If he based his evaluation of them on their recent speeches, he would distrust them. But he's seen them in action, so he trusts them. He adds that he cannot do anything further to defend justice, but it would be impious to do so. So he offers this succor. And this is the second time that Socrates has been compelled to be in a situation in which he would rather not participate. I guess I already made that point. But the whole sequence of events then resembles a trial under which the accused is compelled to give testimony on his own behalf. Okay, I'll reveal to you now something about Plato's art of writing, his dramatic art. As Plato describes this mock trial of Socrates, we're going to witness a step-by-step reversal. All great writers are masters of reversal. And what Socrates does is he carries out a trial of Athens. I mean, the mock trial of Socrates is, as it were, appropriated. I mean, you take possession of something if you appropriate it. Appropriated by Socrates and transformed into a mock trial of the city of Athens. And we'll see that as we go through the Republic. So now what Socrates does is introduce analogy. Now we've already seen that analogy is absolutely central to the Socratic argumentative method, right? It was a series of analogies with Polemarchus, analogies with the crafts, and a series of analogies with the crafts with Thrasymachus. It seems to be how Socrates thinks. Nearly every step of the way forward is in terms of some analogy with the crafts, right? So that's how Socrates manages to motivate his arguments. Okay, so here's another one. Whereas in book 1, justice was set in analogy with art, medicine, navigation, cobblery, so on and so forth. Here, the soul, by contrast, is placed in analogy with the polis. Okay, so now we've left art to one side, and we're looking at a certain sort of human society called the polis. Now, I have to remind you guys, what's the polis? A small, homogeneous, racially homogeneous, nearly virtually self-sufficient political community. We would look at it and say it's the size of a city, but it stands on its own, okay? Now, there's a certain peril of analogies. To know the unknown, say justice, one compares it to the known. This is the value of analogy. Analogy has a cash value. If there's something you don't know, right, like the very nature of justice, you compare it to something that you think you do know, the arts, okay, and then you transfer something from what you do know to that which up to that point you didn't understand too well. You guys following me? Okay. And take notes, folks. You'll be held responsible because when I read your paper at the end of the semester, I'm expecting you to demonstrate you actually learned something and aren't just, producing thoughts willy-nilly out of your own skull, but that you have engaged in a kind of back and forth with your professor, at least, via the journal method, so on and so forth, through the entire semester, so that by the end of it, we together have succeeded in initiating you by some degree into the Society of Philosophers, right? Let's say there are 33 degrees, like in Freemasonry or something like that. There aren't really. There's no formal system. So here we go. But I need to see that you've actually been initiated, let's say, to the 3rd degree or something like that, right? Because we'll be working hard. So this whole procedure of analogy presupposes that one knows enough about the unknown to set it in analogy with something known. That's one of the methodological difficulties of analogy. So you say, all right, I don't know exactly what the soul is, but apparently I know enough about it to know that if I set it in analogy with the city, which I know better, then I'll be able to learn what I need to know about the soul through that analogy. So the procedure can appear to be somewhat circular. In order to know something about the soul, I already have to know something about the soul. And I don't see any way out of that difficulty, by the way. All right, let's turn back to the question of justice. We are familiar with justice. Without this familiarity, there could be no discussion about it at all. You could even formulate a question. Nor could there be moral or political action, nor human experience, nor human species. We would degenerate into basically higher primates. So human existence rests upon moral concepts that are not necessarily yet known with precision, okay? And then human history involves a struggle to know these concepts better and eventually to realize them more fully in our social and political institutions. You guys follow? All right, let's go. Next slide, the analogy between the city and soul, part 2. Socrates shifted the attention from justice to the soul. The soul, that would be the subject of justice, or one of the subjects of justice, the others being a life and action. The soul is that in which justice may first come to be, and then second, exist in a stable way, such that its formal identity is available for intellectual analysis. So this helps a little bit here, because all Socrates is presupposing is that there are just and unjust cities. That's a fair assumption. And so if we can just figure out what justice is in a city, on the assumption that there is justice in some cities at least, and at least it's possible for a city to be just, then we can then define it and then attribute that to the soul. Now that does presuppose that justice in a city and justice in the soul will be the same thing, right? So the proposal is to construct now a city in speech with Glaucon and Adeimantus in order to witness justice coming to be in it and to learn about its nature once it is there. This is an undertaking naturally appealing to ambitious young men. It fires the imagination, it stimulates the desire for honor, and promises intellectual stimulation. I mean, how many of you like the idea of our picking up and taking over an island I have in mind? It wouldn't be that difficult, okay? And we'll pool our credit card resources together. I know an arms dealer. I know a place to train in Maine, okay? And I have access to food. And I have a friend down in Aquidneck who give me access to a couple of yachts. I know a couple of welders. We can reinforce them. I know a firearms expert out in Foster. I'm serious, I do. Who can forge cannon for us. He's done that. See what I'm saying? And so we're gonna, and you know, getting our hands on firearms is easy enough. And we're gonna equip ourselves, and we're gonna take over this Caribbean island. And there we're gonna found a genuinely just society. You get it? All right. Now some of you are saying that's a little bit much, Dr. Shikiari. Yeah, you're right. I would never do that. But for some people, that would be appealing. Founding your own state. I mean, there's something romantic about it, no? So you know, we'd go. We wouldn't want to hurt anybody. Say we're taking over. And you know, what I have in mind is a small one. There's hardly anybody on it. So whatever. So the level of discussion has been raised relative to Book 1, in which competitive acquisition defined the horizon within which the interrogations unfolded, right? So you had Cephalus the moneymaker, Polemarchus, basically a kind of glorified thug taking land and possessions from neighboring cities, Thrasymachus, who approved of that way of living, okay? But now in Book 2, we're presupposing higher values, nobility of conduct, the intrinsic goodness of justice, which they're trying to defend, supposedly, right? And two noble youths, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are naturally attracted to these higher values. So Book 2 is a step up from Book 1 from a moral point of view. So the difficulty, again, is that the whole procedure can appear circular, right? So I've already explained that enough. The analogy between the city and the soul, Part 3. The level of discussion has been raised. Now let me see here. I'm sorry, I didn't erase that. So I have to get rid of that. So now let's talk about the natural city, or city of utmost necessity. Someone got confused by the use of the word city here and said there can't be a city of 4 people or 5 people. Maybe it's a stretch to call it a city. So let's just call it a natural community or a natural society, if the word city doesn't make sense to you. Note that as the argument proceeds, we gain a clearer and clearer vision of Socrates' underlying thoughts. The process is one of his mask of irony, again being gradually removed, okay? It's a gradual process. Socrates, that process of removing his mask, that's also a process of his revealing, as if it had to be done to any further degree, the true nature of political society in a Greek polis, or the true nature of Athens particularly. It's a rather raw reality once you look at it for what it is. Okay. So Socrates and Adeimantus lay down 2 principles. One is the principle of neediness. Number 1, no man is biologically self-sufficient. So, you know, if you were thinking about moving out to the woods on your own, you got to think carefully about that, because if it's true that no man is by himself self-sufficient, you know, Grizzly Adams type guy, then it wouldn't work out. Now, I think there are people who are doing that, so this is probably false, but they assume it for the sake of the argument. The second may be called the principle of economic efficiency. Okay, this is one man, one job. Each person should perform one job, no more, and that's it. By the way, that rules out democracy. Okay? If you're a cobbler, you have no business in politics. If you are a farmer, likewise. If you are an electrician. They didn't have them back then. We have them now, likewise, and so on. So the result is a city composed of 4 or 5 men, each of whom does a job to satisfy the needs of the others. As this city does not, let's see, I have a typo there. As this city does nothing more nor less than satisfy absolutely basic needs, it is called the city of utmost necessity. Okay? That's what he means by that. All it does is satisfy needs. It doesn't provide for any superfluous desires. Would that sound nice? After this, would you like to take a break and listen to some music that pleases you, even though strictly speaking is not needed? Sure, right? Because all of us like to do things which fall into the category of luxury. Okay, so he is silent about the presence or absence of women. So this city seems to have no women, in which case we can say that it's going to last about the predictable duration of a human life. And when these men die, that'll be the end of the city. But he's not trying to found a city that's going to last. He's trying to found something that'll enable us to see and understand the nature of justice. It's a city that exists for a purely philosophical purpose, and it only exists in speech anyway. So when asked where would justice be, where would it have come into being, Adeimantus answers, it is somewhere in some need these men have of one another. Okay. Glaucon then describes the simple pastoral life these men would enjoy. But they never get to determine what justice is, as Glaucon interrupts. Now, you recall Thrasymachus' interruption. When people become passionate, they interrupt, right? And I'm sure sometime in the recent past couple of weeks, you were talking, someone interrupted you because they became passionate. And I think you probably interrupted somebody in the last 2 weeks because your passions got stirred up. Okay, that's how we are. So we may offer that justice in this city would involve a kind of equilibrium of exchange, each producing what others need and each receiving what he needs from the others. So justice, if we're to try to figure out what it is, this is always how it is with Plato. Whenever he's leading you to the important thought, he doesn't actually state it out loud. He compels you to think about it and draw the lesson from the text, because it's a kind of test. And how to put this? He only wants to keep company with people who are willing to work for wisdom. Okay? I can't put it any more plainly than that. He'll only keep, and he's dead now, of course, but I happen to believe he has an immortal soul, but no matter. He only wants to keep company with people who are willing to really work in order to gain wisdom. Not only that, but are actually able to take steps towards it. All right? All right, I'll leave it at that. So we may offer that justice. Okay, we have that. So justice would here to be or to involve a kind of equality of exchange. But that's never stated. Okay. And that would for him be a kind of both social and economic definition of justice, or at least partial account of justice. So it's worth thinking about. Glaucon, however, objects to the absence of luxury. Okay? So he says, we can't stop there. This is a city of pigs, he says, right? Who eat unseasoned meats. I want mustard, effectively, and Worcestershire sauce. Now, this is stuff that we pick up at a Stop and Shop and whatnot, but back then, they didn't have a Stop and Shop back then. So mustard and Worcestershire sauce back then, they didn't have it. But if they had it, it would have been a great delicacy, right? For them, that'd be a luxury. Technically, it's a luxury now, right? I mean, in a certain respect. I mean, it's easily acquired, but you can see what I'm saying. It's not necessary. It does make your meats richer. Meat's rich to begin with. And it has something of the odor of luxury about it. So Socrates responds that what Glaucon wants is a fevered city. This is a city devoted to satisfying more than the natural biological needs of human beings. A fevered city will need luxury artisans to make seasonings, sweets, perfumes, ointments, ornaments, and the like. And these artisans will require more land in which to live. How are they going to get this land? Well, the city is going to have to take possession of this land. And so here's a thesis for you. Luxury is the cause of war. Wasn't that what's going on here? Why is there a war between the Ukraine and Russia? We found out today why there's a war between the Ukraine and Russia. Okay, there's probably more than one cause here, but one cause was stated by Lindsey Graham and on camera with what's his name, Zelensky. He said, well, the Ukraine is sitting on trillions of dollars. Or he said sitting on $1 trillion of natural resources, and we'll just keep you guys going. We'll keep sending you money and arms, and you said you're willing to fight, and we'll do that, so we can more or less get our hands on that $1 trillion worth of resources without sacrificing any of our own population. I'm making it sound it's a touch rawer than Lindsey Graham put it, but that's what he was getting at. You can watch the video if you can find it. So luxury is the cause of war, right? There's something to that, guys, okay? So the principle of one man, one job implies that there must be a standing army that does the work of taking and keeping territory. Okay, so that's what that is. So that's going to require that we introduce a new class of person whom Socrates calls the guardians. So you can think of them as kind of like the police and the army at once, okay? So the very existence of a specialized class of warriors creates a problem. What's the problem there, guys? You go to a third world country, you know instantly what the problem is that the police aren't working for you. Not if you're an ordinary guy. You can't get anything done with these people unless you bribe them, okay? So your police force can quite easily turn on the people. That's the difficulty. In ancient Rome, it was known that at least during the not during the period of the Republic, but during the Empire, the people were under the thumb of the soldiers, right? So this is a very serious problem. All right. So not only that, that your police force, again, look at the history of third world countries. Your army and police can take over the state. How many times have military dictatorships been set up in Central and South America and Africa? I've lost count, okay? And, some persons have suggested that we have something sort of resembling that in the United States. It's not exactly that. But they call it the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower called it the military-industrial and technological complex. I think that's closer to the truth right there. I'd call it the military, industrial, technological, and finance complex. They were much closer to the truth if you put all that together. But even that's inadequate. We have a very complicated system here. It's a system of power, of deception, of the control of human behavior, which goes way beyond, I think, anything Plato could have imagined. Though when we get to Book 7, you'll see the picture he offers there is actually quite illuminating and does give us insights about our present reality. Anyway, trained dogs show that it is possible to train an animal to be harsh only to strangers and friendly only and always to those familiar to them, right? So you get a Doberman Pinscher, right? Those are aggressive dogs, or a pit bull. Okay, you can train those dogs, be careful with the pit bull, to be aggressive, harsh, relative to strangers, and friendly to you. Okay, that's part of training a dog. So they can be trained to help friends and harm enemies. Oh, there's helping friends and harming enemies again, guys. All right, so it's poked its head back into this polis that they are describing. So notice this, so when Socrates is saying it's possible to train human beings this way, and he analogizes them to animals, right? And so this is a way of animalizing human beings. It makes me think of psychology departments and what they used to call behaviorism. Behaviorism is out of vogue nowadays, but the idea was that we can focus merely on human behavior and study more or less the conditions that go into conditioning human behavior as if we're animals. Okay, so the solution to the problem is Socratic education. So now we get to see what Socrates had in mind in Book 1 when he introduced the idea of the true ruler, the person who perfects his subjects in virtue, okay? Again, that Socratic mask being torn off. He merely mentioned the true ruler in book 1. Now we're going to get to look at his curriculum and his principles of rule and of pedagogy. All right. So the purging of luxury. The deep problem rests in the principle that each man loves what is his own. Okay? We call this simply love of one's own for short. Isn't that true? So you have a person who has property, and then he considers the commons. You know, many places have had a commons. That's property he owns in common with other people. What's he going to put more attention into, and more care into, and invest his money into? Commons or his own property? Now, some of you are saying, well, obviously, I think most of you are saying, obviously, he'll invest in his own property more than in the commons. Okay. That answer, I think, betrays that our own community has sunk to a certain level of egoism, and that is a kind of moral corruption, not to accuse you of anything. I'm part of this community too. I understand exactly that thought. But I think if we lived in a community where we worked shoulder to shoulder in the commons, cultivating the crops together, and these fed our families, we might have a different answer. Okay, but anyway, love of one's own is something real. And if you're from Boston, 19 times out of 20, you're a Red Sox fan, not a Yankees fan, right? 99 times out of 100. And if you're born in the Bronx, you are a Yankees fan. If you're born within sight of whatever the Mets stadium is, you're a Mets fan, right? So people love their own. And you love your own brother and your own sister better than the brother and sister of your friend. Typically. Okay. Thus, if a person is forced to choose between looking after, we already have that. Okay. Let's move forward. Socratic education. Socrates' solution consists of 3 parts. First, one must deny the guardians anything that is peculiarly their own. Okay, so you got to follow this now. How are we going to get these guardians to overcome love of their own? And what's the goal here? To get them to participate in a single-minded dedication to the common good. All right? So where'd that come from? Well, we need, if we're going to have guardians, and they're not going to effectively perform a coup d'etat and take the state and subject to their own tyranny, then we have to make them serve the state. And we're only going to succeed at doing that if we completely suppress all of their desire for their own good and induce them to identify their good with that of the state. That's the idea, okay? And the first step, we have to deny them anything that's peculiarly their own. They can't have any possessions. And there has to be a communism, as he says, of women and children. And from the female point of view, a communism of men. So no marriage and universal accessibility, though there'll be rules governing the communion of men and women, the universal accessibility of all members of the opposite sex. And that'll have to be regulated for purposes of procreation. So without which you can't continue your city. There have to be babies. So second, there is to be a thorough formation of character through a judicious combination of poetry and gymnastics. Okay, so we're going to take possessions away from these persons, these guardians, take their families away from them. We won't take the sexual act away. They have to do that to keep the city in existence. And then we'll train them with poetry and gymnastics. By the way, these were the actual principal elements of existing Greek education. Okay? So this part's not too radical. Poetry is introduced to produce the character trait of gentleness. Gymnastics is introduced to generate or produce harshness. We want to produce a kind of weave of gentleness and harshness. Or how about this? Kindness and toughness. Don't you want people who are both kind, but when the going gets tough, they're tough enough to handle it? Okay, so this, what Plato's talking about here, doesn't sound, when you put it in modern terminology, it doesn't sound absurd. It sounds like something we want. Okay, I have some people in the class who intend to get married. So female members of the class who intend to get married and have kids, do you want a strong but gentle man? How's that sound? Strong, so he can tough it out during tough times, but he's gentle too. He was gentle to you and the kids, right? All right. So third, the leaders are to tell a noble lie. Okay, it doesn't stop with the poetry and gymnastics. Now we confront this paradoxical concept of a noble lie. How can a lie be noble? Maybe, possibly, if it achieves a noble end, right? So the lie is a means to a truly noble end that cannot be achieved otherwise than through the lie, then just possibly, if the end justifies the means, just possibly we can talk about a noble lie. All right, so here's the noble lie. It has three parts. Every citizen is born of the earth, which is their very mother. Each person is born with gold, silver, iron, or copper in their souls. And those born with gold are to be the rulers. Those born with silver, now where the rulers come from, you just introduced that. Those born with silver are to be pure soldiers, auxiliaries. And those born with iron or copper are to be wage earners. Okay, now we see how Book 1 actually anticipates the rest of the Republic. So Cephalus corresponds to a wage earner, merchant. Artisans fit there too, by the way. Polemarchus, he's a pure soldier. That's an auxiliary. And then Thrasymachus and Socrates were sparring over being the ruler, right? Each had his own sort of legislation in mind. We never get to see exactly what Thrasymachus' legislation is, but we do get to see Socrates. We're seeing it now. Excellent. So Socrates says this is not enough. We're not going to stop there. We have to, this is a timely topic. We have to introduce censorship. So now it has been determined publicly that the Biden administration forced, there have been a number of revelations, forced Twitter at the time under the leadership of Jack Dempsey, is that his name? And Facebook under the leadership of whatever that guy's name, Zuckerberg, to censor information about COVID. And now the cat's out of the bag. A lot of people are, I keep saying this, say it again, people are getting sick, and they're wondering what's making them sick, and some people are dying, and they're wondering what's causing that. Not the people who just died, but the people who witness other people die. Okay, my student, did I say this yet? My student at PC just lost her friend who died suddenly. My supervisor died suddenly. A teacher in Cranston, I think a year and a half ago, died suddenly. One in Johnston died suddenly. Both of them in front of their classroom, by the way. And yeah, true, people do die suddenly. And pardon me if I'm repeating myself. I can't remember what I've said to whom. In my life up to the age of 50 or so, and I knew two people who died suddenly, possibly three, but two. So but that's one every 25 years. Or 16.6 years, depending upon how you count it. Okay. Well, now recently, I've heard a lot of people dying suddenly because also my friend over at the library there, she said she went to seven funerals in a very short period of time. That was last year too. If I ask her now, I wonder if she's gone to more. And my other friend said she has 4 family members. They haven't died suddenly, but all of them have the same heart condition. And then my sister-in-law's husband of sorts, I think he had 3 family members, all of whom suffered like blood clots in the lung and things of that sort. Okay. So this whole censorship question becomes very serious because now people are suspecting that the COVID, what they call the vaccine, technically it's not really a vaccine, is behind this because all these health problems. And there's been a colleague of mine died of turbo cancer. Another colleague of mine died of some mystery cause. They won't talk about it. He was 47 years old. Okay, so now people are noting that all these health problems have been kind of spiked. Heart problems, cancer, so on and so forth, sudden death, blood clotting, and things of that sort. All this has spiked since 2021. And what one thing got introduced into a lot of the population in 2021 that could possibly be taken to be the cause, and that would be the COVID potion. So you can look at here. I think I recommended this video. I'll do it again in case you forgot. You don't have to like Joe Rogan. I think he says a somewhat he's something of a mixture between a conservative and a liberal. You know, he goes right on some questions, left on others. But he interviews a guy named Brett Weinstein, who's an expert in this stuff, Weinstein. And he has a couple of interviews with Weinstein. One of those is with Weinstein and his doctor, Pierre Kory, Kory. Okay, and for some reason these haven't been taken down from YouTube. I think I know why, but I'm not going to get into that. And you can watch those and get some kind of very intelligent and subtle and analytically precise take on what's going on. Because Weinstein, he is no slouch. He's a smart guy. All right, so do that. That'll help you. Let's see here. So poetry must do more than make the guardians gentle, okay? In order to channel the natural love of one's own into a politically salutary, means healthy direction, poetry must instill a single-minded devotion to the public good. There it is. So from this point of view, we'll need censorship. The following elements have to be purged from poetry. Scenes of gods doing injustice. Absolutely not. Can't have that. Absolutely can't have it. Heroes weeping, or like, what if we had poetry that depicted, put gods to one side, depicted George Washington performing an act of injustice and getting away with it, right? And we know he chopped down the cherry tree. That probably didn't happen, but we think he did. It's a story that gets passed around. But what if we have, George Washington, cheating on his wife and, stealing money, so on and so forth, and just doing these unjust things, just getting away with it, and he becomes president for 2 terms and is worshipped by everybody as some great man. Can't have that. Can't have it. You can't have it. It's going to corrupt the kids. You can't have it. You can't give kids that model. All right. And I agree. You can't hand children that particular model. You can't do it. You can't. You'll destroy them. All right. You can't show them heroes weeping or raging. Oh, that's a step beyond what I just suggested, right? You guys have to think about that. You have to banish all depictions of crying women. All right, this is a very severe program of censorship, folks. Okay, I'm not going to endorse these last 2, but maybe you would. I don't know. How hard-headed are you guys? You guys tell me. How about this one? You're going to banish Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock because they make people laugh too much, right? We don't want to have any depictions of laughter. You're like, why? Well, laughter is the involuntary shaking of the body. It exhibits a lack or loss of self-control. What we want is our citizens to be on the Biden regime, right? Okay. Biden would be envious. He'd look upon this, that Plato. There's something going on. He has some good ideas, right? People who surround him and supported that policy probably read the policy to him and made him say it out loud before they jacked him up with amphetamines and got him lucid enough to speak for 5 minutes. So poetry must include nothing but the following: representations of men and women performing moderate and graceful actions, and deeds of heroism and self-sacrifice. By the way, some of you are saying, "Oh, he's a Trump supporter." I think Trump's a wicked man. Like, who do you support? Listen, if the choice is between Godzilla and King Kong, I don't support either of them. All right? Sorry. So we want representations of men and women performing moderate and graceful actions. In the matter of, have you seen any BBC productions of the British aristocracy in the 18th century? Right? We want people behaving like that, in a very genteel way. And deeds of heroism and self-sacrifice. Excellent. Like Patriot by, what's his name? Who was the guy in all the Lethal Weapon films? Well, I can picture him. I can't see his name. Gibson, right? Mel Gibson. So yeah. So how Mel Gibson behaves himself in the film Patriot. Okay. So the god that would be good from Plato's point of view. That'd be great. Or how Mel Gibson appeared in the film Braveheart, a perfect hero, indefatigable, always on the side of justice, didn't give a single thought to his own safety, nothing. Life of pure self-sacrifice for the sake of the freedom of Scotland. Okay? And Patriots, a parallel story about the freedom of the colonies. So the God is to be depicted as unchanging, incapable of lying, and the cause of all that is good, and nothing of what is bad. We're taking an inch towards Christian doctrine there, okay, and Jewish doctrine. You know, a Jewish doctrine is a little bit more complicated. Since the destruction of the Second Temple, a few things have happened in Judaism. The formulation of the Talmud, presumably it existed around the time of Jesus Christ, but they finally wrote it down. It got codified, I believe, in the 5th century AD, around there, by Judah the Prince. I might have the date wrong. And then the formulation of Kabbalah, which just means that which is handed down, tradition, and that's a set of magical and mystical doctrines, which effectively is a kind of Gnostic interpretation of Scripture, which is meant to prepare for the world for the coming of the Jewish Messiah, who's different from the Christian Messiah. The Jewish rabbis, this should come as no surprise, they describe Jesus Christ as, from their point of view, he's a criminal, right? Okay. And you can even find in rabbinical writings that he's the greatest criminal ever. Well, I guess what they mean by that is that he deceived a portion of the Jewish nation and prepared the historical path towards the victory of Christendom and the subordination of the Jewish nation under the false religion that he founded. So they describe him as a great criminal for that reason. So does God remain something unchanging? You know, when you go to Kabbalah, God in himself is Ein Sof, and he's utterly undescribable. So it's a little bit different from what we're describing here, because you simply can't describe him at all. Okay, leave it at that. The result is that Homer and the poets must be banished from the perfect city. Now, who's Homer? Now, all of you are thinking of Homer Simpson. Plato very definitely was not thinking of Homer Simpson, who was not even a cartoon at that time. No, Homer was a poet, a great epic poet of the Greek tradition. And part of your homework will be to look up Homer, not Homer Simpson, Homer the poet in YouTube, and watch a 5-minute video on him, okay? Or look him up online and just get a couple of paragraphs on him. He wrote the Iliad about the Trojan War, and the Odyssey about Odysseus's 10-year struggle to get home to his wife Penelope and his kingdom. All right, so after all is said and done here, guys, all we have left is obviously patriotic propaganda. Okay. You know what? I'll take that over pseudo-vaccine propaganda. Here we go. Farmer propaganda. So Adeimantus's objection. Adeimantus now objects that the members of the guardian class will not be happy. This reintroduces the problem of the relation between justice and happiness, right? Okay, here it is again. What's the relation? So we've been pursuing this rigorous sort of curriculum of that would make our guardians and auxiliaries particularly just, and that they would do their job and give to others what's due to them, right? And so that definition from the city of utmost necessity is coming back, isn't it? This idea that each person should effectively render unto everyone else in the city what is due to them with respect to the satisfaction of needs, and each should receive from the others what is necessary to satisfy their needs. I mean, it seems to be a kind of concept of equilibrium and exchange, which is still operative at this point, okay? So that's why we went through that first step there with the city of utmost necessity. It never really went anywhere. Glaucon expanded it into the fevered city, and now Socrates is quickly trying to get rid of the fever with more or less success. So Socrates responds to this challenge that Adeimantus brought forward. First, we should not be surprised that the guardians are actually the happiest in the city. Okay. Why should we take that seriously at all? I mean, they don't get to go to the movies. Okay. They don't smoke marijuana. Neither do I. I have no interest in it. Boy, when I've driven by the dispensary or stopped there for a sec, um, not to buy anything, but it's because I was there. They're doing a brisk business. People are just walking in and out of that place all day long. It's amazing. People, So they don't get to do that. They don't get to go to any rock concerts. Okay. And they don't get to engage. They're not allowed to eat too much, right? So on and so forth. And they don't even have the pleasures of the family, just sitting there at the dinner table or on the couch with their kids milling about them, and they're all eating ice cream together. They don't have any of that either. What do they have? Well, they have a few things. They have good character, so their very conduct is pleasant. That's number one. Number two, they don't hanker after anything like money or power. They already have some power. The amount that's assigned to them is what they have, and that's it. And there's no question if they're getting more. So they don't even think about it. There's no question of getting money or land. So they don't give that any thought. So they're not bothered by what is not even a possibility. You guys follow me? Um, they're in excellent physical condition. Okay, so they feel healthy all the time. As being one of these people would be pleasant insofar as one's very life would be filled with a kind of sense of physical vitality. Sound good? Okay. They have a noble mission, the preservation of the freedom of the city. They have honor. They're given a place of great honor in the city. And as far as food, they are very definitely sufficiently nourished because these are professional soldiers, so they're getting plenty to eat. Okay, so that there's no issue there. They're not allowed to be gluttons, but they're not even allowed they're not allowed to eat too little either. Okay, because they have to keep fit. Am I leaving anything out? They do play music. They do sing. Plato didn't say the melodies have to be bad. He just said that the poetry has to be a certain quality. As far as the music, it could be as good as Mozart. I wouldn't be Mozart. Mozart's a little bit corrupt, but it could be something more in the line of Palestrina or someone like that. Palestrina is this famous 16th century Catholic composer. Wrote spiritual music, but it's all very nourishing and so on and so forth. You could have stuff like that, right? Maybe some Bruckner of the 19th century. His stuff is more strident and martial in spirit. That would be good for Guardians, right? So it's quite possible this is correct, that the Guardians would be the happiest in the city. We just can't appreciate that immediately because they're sort of our opposites. And their lives seem to involve the deprivation of all the things that we crave. But maybe it's the craving itself that's making us unhappy. And if we were to be deprived first of these things and second of the craving, that would be a step towards being genuinely happy. Then if we got, physical fitness and honor and halfway decent music and genteel habits and things of that sort, we'd actually find ourselves satisfied. So it's arguable that they're the happiest people in the city. Okay. Second, the aim is to make a happy city. And it is necessary for this aim that each part be exactly as it need to be in order to fulfill our intention. You know what? This is news to me. I didn't know that the aim was to make a happy city. But now that he said it, it makes sense, because originally the question was, what's the connection between justice and happiness? And that question has remained somewhat submerged. But yeah, we're supposed to observe justice coming into existence in a city, right? Want to see how it comes into existence and then what it is, and then have a look at its effect on that city. Yeah, of course. So we want to have a look at whether the city is happy or unhappy. We're trying to make the city happy on the supposition that by making it just, it'll be happy as a city. So guardians must be precisely such as to be least disposed to harm the city, and the education described is the best for accomplishing this end, and thus the end of making a happy city. Okay. So, I just went through all the reasons for holding the guardians to be happy, and here they are again. So I think I covered all of these just from memory. The only new thing here I see is they would never be idle. Idleness produces unhappiness, but then your mind begins wandering. You start thinking about stuff you don't have. Okay. If ever, you want a cure for the demons? I don't mean literal demons. I mean, just kind of stuff haunting, tugging at one in one's thoughts. Have a family. It's over. There's no worry about, oh, nobody likes me, or all nonsense of that sort. That is pure nonsense too, by the way. All nonsense of that sort goes away. By the way, I don't want to sound callous and like I'm dismissing somebody's predicament if that person, someone's still getting his footing early in life, maybe has some difficulty making friends in high school or in college, and just trying to figure things out, doesn't yet know how to talk to people. That can be difficult for a guy like that or a woman like that. So I don't want to sound like I'm not sympathetic. I'm very sympathetic, and if you find yourself in that position, give yourself a little time. Okay, it's going to work out. You just have to kind of interact with people and figure out how to get on with people. You'll figure that out. All right, don't worry about that. Just believe in yourself and keep going. But those sorts of concerns vanish once you get married and have kids, because there's no time to think about that sort of thing. Okay, so here we go. I think we went through those, so we'll skip this slide. So then we get to the virtues. So here we are. Socrates directs Glaucon and Adeimantus to take up the analogy with the soul. It works out in the following way. Okay. The rulers in the city correspond to the intellect and the soul, and the virtue, arete, is wisdom. He defines it as good counsel for both oneself and others. Okay, so that virtue that perfects the intellect, and in the city it perfects the rulers. The auxiliaries, right, the police military, that corresponds to what he calls spiritedness, as thumos, the seat of honor, of wrath, and of lesser irritable affects. This corresponds to the virtue of courage, and courage is believing what the rulers say is terrible, and what is not terrible is not. So it's a conventional concept of courage relative to what rulers, in their wisdom, would legislate courage to be. So that's a rather curious definition of courage. But the auxiliaries, they would regard the loss of the freedom of the city or its destruction as terrible, the loss of their own lives not. You guys follow? And then there are the wage earners, and they hardly get discussed at all. These are craftsmen or merchants. They correspond to desire, epithumia, the desire, which, by the way, seems to characterize likewise Thrasymachus, his desire for more and more. And as far as virtue, well, there seems to be none. Now, the question is, whatever happened to justice and moderation? Well, justice is a virtue that, as a matter of fact, is spread throughout the whole city and the whole soul, respectively. He defines it as minding one's business. So that doesn't mean what we mean by it, like not nosing into your neighbor's business, like their marriage or something like that. It refers to keeping one's mind on the performance of one's social function. And for that reason, it's anti-democratic. It's an anti-democratic definition of justice. Let the rulers rule, the warriors fight, and the workers work. Okay? It does presuppose one man, one job. What if you have two businesses, right? One is shoemaking. Oh, by the way, my cobbler also died suddenly. How's that sound? I have a picture of him there on the business. It says right there he died suddenly. Okay, I'm telling you, this is not making this stuff up. Look up what's his name? Mark Crispin Miller, M-A-R-K Crispin not K C C-R-I-S-P-I-N M-I-L-L-E-R. He keeps track of this stuff every week. In August, pardon me if I'm repeating myself, 9 high school football players died suddenly in August. That's very strange, guys. It's serious. Okay, would you please start paying attention to this? Watch the Weinstein and Pierre Corey, because Corey prescribes. He's an actual medical doctor. I can't say anything about this stuff, but he can. He prescribes remedies. All right. Temperance, sophron sude, is defined simply as obedience to the ruling part, the rulers of the intellect. So the just man is one whose intellect rules his whole soul. His spirited faculty follows the judgments of his intellect, and his lower passions are gratified or not gratified simply in accordance with the rule of reason. Okay. And C.S. Lewis put it this way: you rule your stomach, the stomach is ruled by the intellect via the chest. So the stomach is ruled by the head via the chest. So the stomach, that's sort of the area of desire. The chest is the area of spiritedness, thumos, and the head is the area of the intellect. And you have to get the intellect, you have to get spiritedness on the side of the intellect as opposed to on the side. Some people get angry if you challenge their passions, right? Very common. Other persons get angry if you say anything which besmirches what is noble and good in accordance with the rule of the intellect. Okay. So how is this doctrine of more than antiquarian interest? Let's see. Aside from the point we have made, we've already seen a number of connections with contemporary experience, so I think we've already answered that question. But let's see, maybe there are some more general statements we can make. Aside from the point we have made about freedom resting in reason, when did I make that point? I'm going to make it right now. You can't be free unless your thinking is free. I'll say that. You can't be free unless your thinking is free. Okay? So you have to pursue truth and wisdom. So that's just a fact. We can also see how Plato's analysis offers a foundation for the beginning of an understanding of what we call identity politics. Though Plato does not mention identity politics, he does talk quite a lot about that in which a person takes pride. Okay, I see what I'm getting at. The faculty of spiritedness is that seat of the attitude of being proud of X, where X gets filled in with a wide variety of contents depending on the person. What is identity politics other than the politics of one's identifying as whatever it is? Identifying as a member of this race, ethnicity, religious group, sexual orientation, or something else. Okay? And then not merely identifying, but then basing one's sense of self-worth, okay, in that identity. That's what it is, okay? And then fighting for the interest of the persons who belong to that particular identity group on the basis of your sense of self-worth, or what we might even call your pride, okay? So I think we have a key into that now. In previous periods of history, they spoke rather of honor and even of the honor of one's estate. So your class membership, whether you were of the laboring class or the merchant class or the fighting class, the knights, right? The knights with their squires, or of the ecclesiastical class, as a priest, or this peculiar group of people who are really lay people, but who took religious vows, so nuns and monks and people of that sort. It has to do with what one is motivated to defend in speech and action. Now, spiritedness, right? I would say that again. Honor has to do with what one is motivated to defend in speech and action. What are you? Ask yourself right now, what are you motivated to defend in speech and action? Well, that's what you're spirited about. It may, and there's even a certain probability it connects with your sense of identity, right? It connects with your sense of self-worth. And whatever degree of pride, it might be a degree of proper pride, right? Pride can go too far, but we talk about proper pride when it's not gone too far. A judicious, not a judicious, but a healthy sense of one's dignity, right? Okay, so spiritedness is clearly a faculty that can produce a beautiful efflorescence when properly cultivated. But just as clearly, it can also bring forth poisoned fruit, no doubt. Applications too. Some morally wholesome actualizations of spiritedness. Let's talk about that. Well, there's courage. If we define this following Aristotle as a moral habit of being able to face down what causes fear for the sake of something good and noble, well, that's definitely good. We can clearly take view here of perhaps the best potentiality latent in spiritedness. This is what you want for yourself. B, honor, a sense of one's worth insofar as one is a moral being called to act in accordance with moral virtue. That's a beautiful efflorescence of spiritedness. So spiritedness is a good thing. However, it can be spoiled. Here's some unwholesome actualizations. Resentment. That's a habitual hatred of someone whom one believes has injured one. whether intentionally or inadvertently. Okay, and the way out of that is the way out of resentment is forgiveness. And many people have talked about the power of forgiveness and how there's a kind of release. I heard a fellow on YouTube talk about that. He grew up, his father beat him and his mother, and then he, for whatever reason, visited his father's grave. I think he had some kind of spiritual prompting, and there he felt a kind of second prompting to forgive his father, did so, and he felt like a great weight come off of himself. So D would be another spoiling of spiritedness would be contempt, a habitual hatred of anyone whom regards as possessing a negative moral value, looking down on people, right? And how do you get free of that? Because in that case, you don't forgive the person because the person hasn't done anything to you, but you have to learn humility, and you have to have you have to frankly admit what's going on in your interior. I say that's one thing. When you look at what's passing through your consciousness in the interior, and call a spade, and describe, assign the true value to impatience, to flashes of irritation, not to mention wrath, to being too ready to laugh at people and take joy in their pain or their ugliness or their maladroitness. Okay? One has to call a spade and describe these things for what they are, as morally ugly habits and traits. And then one does this every day, begin to cultivate the habit of humility, and that will deflate the balloon of contempt and put it to death finally. And then you can take your spiritedness and sort of orient that in the right direction towards courage and honor. Loyalty also would fit there, right? Courage, honor, loyalty. Okay. So Plato intimates that spiritedness is at its best when one's sense of honor is connected to the intellectual love of truth, goodness, and beauty. Okay, that's spiritedness as its best. And when one acts courageously for the sake of the same. In Socrates' beautiful city, the auxiliary sense of honor must be based on love of the city for its own sake. That's as high as they can rise. But the rulers, those are philosophers. They have a love of truth, goodness, and beauty for their own sake. That'll be a problem we confront later. Why would they bother with the city if what they're really interested in transcends the city? And that's the end. All right, so that was a relatively long lecture, but hopefully you got a lot of information out of that. Let's see. And you can use that for your paper. And I look forward to reading what you write in your journals to see how well you've engaged with this. So we're all caught up with the syllabus now, by the way, so that's good.